Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. My guest at this time is Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. He joins me now to discuss what taxpayers will be looking at if Senator Bernie Sanders were to become president and get most or at least some of his ambitious agenda accomplished. We'll also get Pete's insights on the latest budget out of the Trump administration. And Pete, thanks very much for being with us.
Always a pleasure.
Well, let's start with a recent analysis from CNBC. This is their reporter, Robert Franks, talking about the price tag for everything Bernie Sanders wants to do.
Sanders has not released the total cost of his plans, but a new estimate by Treasury Secretary Larry Summers finds that Sanders' plans would cost over $60 trillion, that's with a T, over the next decade. That's more than the current total projected spending of the government of $52 trillion. Now, Sanders' biggest ticket item, as we just heard, was Medicare for All. That would cost around $30 trillion over the next decade. His Green New Deal adds another $16 trillion. His Jobs for All plan, giving every American who wants one a federal job, that would add another $7.5 trillion. On top of that, you add his plans for canceling all student debt, universal preschool, universal child care, and the total brings you well over $60 trillion. Now, Sanders has about $20 trillion in new taxes planned, most of that on the wealthy, Wall Street, and corporations. Unclear, though, how he would raise the other $40 trillion or more.
Well, let's skip the $40 trillion for just a moment, Pete, and let's start with the $20 trillion in new taxes over a decade that Sanders says would be on corporations, Wall Street, and the rich. How will he need to define the rich to make the math work on that?
Well, he will certainly be reaching below the billionaires tagline that he often uses when describing the rich, because there simply aren't enough billionaires around to fund an expansionist agenda of this size. And there aren't enough millionaires around either, and we can get into that a little bit more. But we're talking about, for example, a top estate tax rate of 77%. We're talking about a wealth tax that would start hitting individuals and families at the $10 to $20 million range by some estimates, but $30 million is another agreed upon figure. Here's one problem we have, Greg, in that the Sanders campaign has not provided sufficient detail in the form of analytical tables or budget estimates to thoroughly analyze exactly what he is proposing. We can only go by some of the campaign rhetoric and a few specifics that he has offered so far. I can tell you that the top individual tax rate, aside from the estate tax rate, would likely be restored to 70%. That's a figure that Sanders has discussed on the campaign trail. But here's the other thing. That other $40 trillion that remains unaccounted for could mean for some nasty tax hikes on the middle class. Sanders has said a number of times that the health care plan, for example, for which all, and I mean all Americans, would be paying higher taxes, would be worth the trade-off. Well, that trade-off could mean payroll tax increases of 30 to 50%. It could mean the institution of a value-added tax, a type of consumption tax on every good and service you buy, much like they have in Europe. There could be other surprises in there, surtaxes on gasoline, for example, to help fund the Green New Deal. This is going to hit every element of society, not just the rich. And the higher the rates go, ironically, the bigger the chances are that the revenue targets won't get hit. And we can talk about that further.
Well, his argument, of course, has always been that, yes, the taxes are going up, but hey, under my plan with Medicare for All, you don't have to pay a premium anymore. You don't have to pay a deductible anymore. No more copays. So in the end, you actually come out ahead. And you mentioned there's not a lot of detail here, so is there any way to determine whether or not he's right on that?
Well, for one thing, Sanders' plan for expanded universal health care would be more generous than the socialized medicine programs offered in Scandinavia, where you still have some kind of out-of-pocket cost to see a doctor. This is just one problem with offering totally free health care with no consequences. people tend to overconsume something for which they have no out-of-pocket cost. It's just natural human tendency. And if you couple that with probably very aggressive federal promotion of the health care program, you're going to get a much larger cost curve, higher growth in the expense of socialized medicine than probably Senator Sanders even suspects. And as a result, taxes are going to have to go up to essentially keep pace with the rising costs, or debt will go up. And as we know, debt is nothing but higher taxes on some generation of taxpayers in the future.
You mentioned that we can go into a little bit deeper on how higher tax rates eventually gets to the point where you don't get more revenues. This sounds a lot like the Laffer curve, but explain exactly what you mean by that.
Yes, that's exactly what happens. A high tax rate does not necessarily mean much higher tax revenue. Sure, in a very short period of time, if we were to take the current federal combined top income tax rate of around 40% to something like 70%, which is what Sanders has said he longs for, those old days when the tax rates were that high, you might raise more federal revenue over 1 or 2 years after the tax hike is implemented. But then other disincentive effects kick in. Americans change their work strategies, their investment strategies. They move assets overseas, especially the well-to-do. They might decide not to expand business activity if they happen to be paying taxes on small business profits through the 1040 system. You might see someone who has $1 million, $2 million of cash flow take a look at that top rate and say, well, I guess if the government wants the money, they can have it. But next year, I'm certainly not going to employ the 3 more people that I had hoped to put on the job. And suddenly you have another problem, reduced economic activity. And that means a reduction in federal revenues. Sooner or later, these disincentive effects pile up. And it's not just among the wealthy. It's among other elements of society, too. We see it when payroll tax rates go up. We've seen it, for example, when luxury taxes have been imposed under George H.W. Bush, the budget deal that he signed, and the luxury tax on yachts that put thousands of yacht building employees out of work and actually depressed federal revenues on net. You know, these are all disincentive effects that can take their toll on any ambitious plan to raise tax rates.
Pete, you said they either had to raise taxes or just pile on the debt. And both parties, of course, are guilty of that. It all depends on which party's in the White House as to whether you're outraged or it's not a big deal. But I've seen folks on both sides of the aisle, I know you have too, that say, hey, look, debt doesn't really matter. It's an ugly number, but ultimately it doesn't matter as long as inflation stays relatively low and other countries are still buying our debt. Are they right or not?
They're right in the sense that deficits and debt don't matter until suddenly, spectacularly, they do. And the problem is we don't know when we reach that sudden, spectacular point where investors say, you know what, this country is borrowing too much. I no longer have faith in the federal government's ability to repay it or to manage it. I'm going to pull my money someplace else. That's not only true for individuals, but governments and institutional investors. And believe me, we don't ever want to get to that point where the credit worthiness, the very financial stability of the United States is threatened because we have overborrowed. Somewhere we are going to reach that point. Gross federal debt is currently at a level that is about 100% of our annual economic output. Can we sustain that? Well, we obviously are right now. But what about 120% or 150%? We are going to reach those levels as federal entitlement programs begin to consume a greater and greater share of the national economy. Can we manage that? no one has a good idea of whether we can, and we don't want to test that proposition, because if we do and we go over that line, the financial consequences for all Americans will be terrible. That's something that neither political party seems to understand in Washington right now.
Now, Pete, we know that this price tag is what would be the reality if Bernie were to actually get everything he wanted. No president actually gets everything they actually want, so he might get some of it, a lot of it, or a little of it, or none of it. But even if he doesn't get all of it, let's say he packs on, I don't know, $10 or $20 trillion over the next 10 years. The impact on the debt is not as significant as it would be if it were $60 trillion over 10 years. But we also know we have a ticking time bomb on Medicare and Social Security. And so if we're devoting trillions and trillions to some of these other ideas, whether it's Medicare for all or relieving college debt or universal child care or Green New Deal, whatever it is, what happens to the ticking time clock of these other entitlements like Medicare and Social Security?
It moves the clock forward dramatically. I mean, this is the important thing to understand, that federal debt as a percentage of our annual economic output is going to increase dramatically if we do nothing else to spending and taxation policy. The natural financial problems of Social Security and Medicare, the organic troubles on the balance sheet that we began experiencing and which Ross Perot began warning about in the 1990s, those problems are happening now. In 2016, the Social Security boulder began rolling down the hill. By that I mean that the so-called trust fund that had supposedly been accumulating assets in the form of federal IOUs to cover program costs finally began draining. That means that every dollar Social Security cashes in from now on against the federal Treasury is going directly to the national debt. Those IOUs that Social Security is using to pay benefits currently show up right on the negative balance sheet of the U.S. Treasury and will do so for perpetuity, even if nothing else is added in terms of tax hikes or spending increases. So we've got a major problem here if someone gets in the White House with a willing Congress to make matters worse.
We're talking with Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. And Pete, just a minute or two left in our conversation, but I do want to get your thoughts briefly on the budget proposed by President Trump. And much like a candidate's wish list, like Bernie Sanders, the president's proposed budget and the reality that gets approved are rarely in sync. But as you look at Trump's budget, we see lots of proposed cuts in a number of areas, but a lot of folks pointing out that even over 10 years, he doesn't eliminate the deficit. And we're already talking about trillion-dollar deficits right now, including next fiscal year. So what's your analysis on the Trump blueprint?
Yes, unfortunately, we now have a 15-year time frame being proposed for eliminating the deficit. Still a worthy goal, but pushing it out that much further only means less pressure to do something about the spending problems now. The reductions in waste, fraud, and abuse and low-priority programs are admirable. Some of them have been proposed by Democratic and Republican presidents in the past. Difficult to see how Congress is going to go along with them, especially since the president and Congress both agreed to sign into law huge increases in defense and domestic spending in the last budget deal. It's hard to unravel that, either politically or fiscally.
And that was about a year ago at this time, if I remember correctly. And we've heard never again, but we hear that a lot when it comes to federal spending.
Right.
So we'll see what happens from here, and we'll see which Democratic candidate emerges here in the coming weeks. So, Pete, a lot to look forward to. Thanks very much for your time, as always.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. I'm Greg Corombos, reporting for Radio America.